Okay. Okay, welcome everybody to the Science and Data Committee of the Vermont Climate Council. So thank you all for your patience as we got started. And today on the agenda, we have, well, one, I just want to, before we even get into the agenda, this is the first time this committee has met since the Climate Action Plan has been released. So I just want to congratulate Jane in particular, but everybody that's really put in a whole lot of effort to work on the plan and get it done, and to now take a breath, reflect on that, and then forge ahead and work on next steps and implementing it. So congratulations, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. I think, I know I speak for myself, but I assume I speak for others when I say we all know that there is a lot more work yet to do, but I think it's also important to pause to recognize that this committee in particular, but of course the whole council, there was so much that this committee did that helped inform and underpin the plan. And while we are going to look at some of those next steps and things that are still left to do going forward, the plan certainly wouldn't be what it is without a lot of the underpinning and really important kind of analysis and contributions of this subcommittee. So I just want to briefly add my thanks to everybody, both on the subcommittee and who's been following it and contributing with your comments either in the meetings or via written materials you've submitted that have also helped inform our conversations.
Yeah, thank you for that. And of course, want to lift up Marion too, and Julie and Jared, who I jokingly and lovingly now say I think are the only two people who have read the plan start to finish. And then finally, I'll just say that it hit home to me yesterday, because testifying yesterday morning, seeing all the legislators who had the plan bound, like, and already earmarked and tabbed, I was like, oh, people are going to use it. It's really great. So that was really exciting to see it in action.
Okay, so now we can get into the agenda. So what we have for agenda today, apologies that it came out a little bit late, that after we approve minutes or review minutes from November 10th, we haven't met for a month, we'll go in and have a brief presentation on where we are with the monitoring and assessment framework from CADMIS, from Liz Hansen, CADMIS. Then we'll get a quick update from Megan O'Toole from A&R on the progress and discussions around a RFI for upstream and or life cycle emissions. And then briefly at the end, just put in the back of your mind discussion of the subcommittee composition and setting up for a work plan for 2022. So we'll only probably have 10 minutes to do that. So it's really just teeing up the issue for thinking about it next month, but we'll touch on that, have some public comment, and then adjourn at 4. This is an abbreviated Science and Data Committee meeting. So any comments or concerns with the agenda?
I would just note that we recognize this is a short agenda. I think we were challenged by just calendars and being able to get quorum in terms of people's availability, but we just thought that it was better to have a short meeting to make sure that we're checking in post climate action plan, being able to look ahead a little bit to next year, and we'll be planning to schedule longer meetings where we can dig more into the work starting in January. So just don't want people to think that this is, I mean, while we may be able to move to regularly shorter meetings, not to set the expectation that they'll all be 1 hour. We were kind of fitting in what we could before the end of the calendar year.
I think knowing us, I imagine nobody expected 1 hour meetings going forward. Yeah, thanks for fleshing that out though, Jared. So with that, the minutes from the November 10th meeting have been posted on the council's website. Are there any comments or concerns with those minutes?
Just a correction, TJ.
Sure.
It's a spelling, so it's Dupini, not Dupinji. So
Apologies.
not a problem. Always happy to provide the humor on here.
Yeah. I don't know how that got through. You know, my autocorrect actually corrects for your name now.
Good to know.
Okay, so with that correction, any other comments? Hearing none, we will fix that and post the final minutes. So with that,
Before we move off of that, TJ, I just wanted to verify to see if we do have somebody lined up for taking minutes today.
good question. I did not line anybody up.
I pinged Colin to see if Colin could coordinate with Megan or Brian to see if any of them could do it, but I hadn't heard back yet. So now they're officially on the spot.
Yeah, Jane, between the three of us, one of us can do it. That's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go into the monitoring and assessment framework. I'm just going to turn it straight over to Liz for a brief presentation on where we are.
Yep. Thanks, TJ, and thanks for having us back. I'm joined by Dan Mellinger from EFG is also on the line. And we have been chatting with Jane about sort of taking the steps that we had outlined in the framework memo that we submitted ahead of CAP finalization and fleshing out those steps a little bit in terms of what would a scope of work actually look like. Should we sort of carry on with this work? And Jane, feel free to speak up if you want about sort of the contract, but we are anticipating that under our existing scope of work, we'll be continuing to do some of the updates and changes to the pathways report and prioritizing that work, and that this work would likely be sort of under a new scope continuing on into the new year. And Jane is sorting out whether we would be doing that or sort of if it would go out to bid. So just wanted to preface with that, but I'm not sure if Jane has shared with you a brief overview of the scope of work that we would recommend, or if that's coming after this, but I'm going to walk through our concept of some of the tasks and the phasing that we would expect. And we are happy to have a discussion with you, and then we will round that out and put some more details on it for Jane to assess and go from there. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Great. All right. So as you may recall, we talked about sort of four steps in the framework that we've now broken out into 2 phases and probably 6 tasks. So the first phase we anticipate would run about 6 months and would really be about planning the database, making sure that we are really tight and in agreement on what the use cases are, sort of what the goals of it are, and then also taking the CAP and what you've done with the CAP and the final policies that you put in the CAP, and taking Richard's recommendation and building out logic models for that. So mapping out sort of what the policy is trying to achieve backwards to sort of what the metrics that you would be tracking are. And then once those metrics are identified, identifying sort of the data. And so that's really task 2, and task 3 is understanding what it is we're tracking and understanding what data we have available to track it. There will certainly be an identification of the data we have as well as the data we don't have. So we'll be identifying data gaps. And then for any data we do have, we'll be identifying what the characteristics of that data are, sort of how it comes into the state, who owns it, how it's usually integrated, and then making an assessment of what might need to happen in order to get it into a database to be usable. And then that would be very much an iterative process with this committee, we imagine, and then also potentially with the data governance team that this committee recommended, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But we would be presenting you at the end of sort of those two tasks with clear logic model and then a data map built either in Excel or another database of your choosing that says, you know, here's all the data that you can use to assess these metrics. And we would summarize all of that in sort of a set of recommendations that would say, you know, based on all of the discussions that we've had, here are the use cases, here are the logic models, here are the metrics, here's the data, here are the data characteristics. Based on that, we recommend this type of infrastructure to build the database, to manage the database. And that would move us into phase 2, which I'll talk about in a moment. But before I do that, want to also make sure to highlight task 1 here, which is the recommendation from you all and from the secretary, which is very important around data governance. So at the start of this work and sort of throughout this work, we would be working with the correct counterparts at the state or the subcommittee as desired to identify a data governance team. And likely at some point over the course of this work, once that team was up and established, they would also be sharing in a great deal of ownership over the development of tasks 2, 3, and 4. And part of the main goal of doing that is to make sure that we establish a data governance plan for how this data will be managed, how to make sure that it is secure, how to handle it in the right way, disclose it in the right way, making sure that we're taking care of all of those concerns that were very rightfully raised the last time that we talked through this together. And so one of the questions that I would love to talk through with you all today is what interplay you see between this subcommittee, the data governance team, the staff at A&R, et cetera, to make sure that we are building into any final scope that we propose the right amount of liaisoning with each of those important parties. Happy to pause for questions there, but before I do, Dan, do you have anything that you would want to add here?
I'll just chime in to say that the tasks that Liz outlined there, hopefully you see as a reflection of the input that we've heard from this committee, things like that data governance team and plan of a logic model. We worked to include that feedback into the framework memo and also the scope of work. And we really took to heart all of those suggestions and really fully behind this idea of data governance planning and a team to identify things like who owns the data, how do we secure it, who has access to it, how do we update it. Those kinds of issues were heard loud and clear when we were talking with all of the committee members.
Any questions on this before I talk about phase 2? Clarifying questions.
I guess oh, sorry. Leslie Ann, please go first and I'll make a comment after.
Thanks, Jane. I just had a quick question about whether there had been any outreach to folks at VCGI. John Adams, who is part of this subcommittee, who helps to support this subcommittee. He's done a lot of work in the governance area. I was just wondering if he had been sort of brought into the loop as part of this discussion.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think the Cadmus and EFG folks have had discussions with them. It's certainly possible that DPS or EAN have, and I think we would be eager to talk to them and learn from what they've already done. Certainly wouldn't want to be recreating the wheel.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great point, Leslie Ann. And we did have some meetings in order to get to this point with staff from the Public Service Department and EAN and people more specifically involved in some of the monitoring and data work for those the departments and EAN, as well as DEC. And then we've been looking more closely at the way we monitored progress with respect to our clean water work within the Department of Environmental Conservation, thinking about how that can provide some baseline for how we would do this within one agency, appreciating that the work would be across multiple state governments as well, multiple state agencies, I should say, as well as private sector and public nonprofit and elsewhere. So thinking about who else we should be learning from along this way is certainly part of this, what would be the database planning. And I can certainly imagine, coordinating with John Adams and others with BCGI to ensure that we got it right from the setup here. And what I was just going to comment on before when I had raised my hand is just to put a finer point on, we really see this as sort of, we being A&R, as a priority for my role and Marion's role, and the work of A&R support right now is building this over the course of the next year and setting this up as it's spoken to in the GWSA and a really important component of the work. And I will say, though, that, we do have a limited budget right now of our remaining funds for the GWSA, and like building out the budget for a request for more funding for technical analysis. So it'll be important to understand what this could cost. And some of the things that would really inform that is like how much and who is going to be working with Cadmus and ESG and coordinating with. So how many science and data subcommittee meetings versus like a governance structure that seeks to create that cross collaboration back and forth. So that's the kind of stuff I think hopefully we can start to sort of tease out in today's conversation, so that as Liz and Dan and others take this back and turn this into a budget, we can be thinking about that as that informed by what folks like all of you think is important.
Claire just put in the chat there that John's also supporting the DPS project. So there may be already a lot of cross collaborations in place, and his having thought about this a lot because of where he sits in state, looking at it from a geospatial perspective would bring a lot to the table. So thanks for flagging that.
Yeah, and just one other thing I want to pause on. I know that we're kind of identifying kind of broad categories using broad language, but I do think it's really important to pause on something you were talking about, Dan, which is around kind of, I think you phrased it as kind of who has access to the data and data security issues. And one of the things that we agreed as a task group that is really important is that we're taking an open data approach, and that the data would be kind of transparently and publicly available for others to access, and analyze. And I think that that's a really important core principle. What I understand to be kind of some of the access and security, or I might term them kind of data integrity issues, are around instances that we are aware of where if we present data in a disaggregated way rather than an aggregated way, say at a town, county, or statewide level, there can be kind of privacy issues. So for instance, we know if we're looking at presenting kind of electricity consumption by the commercial sector by town, there are some towns where there's such a small number of commercial operators that it would be clear what one kind of private business's electricity usage was. So I just want to be clear that that's the type of thing that we're talking about in terms of security and access, and that what is not being signaled here at all is anything about anything short of a full commitment to transparency and open data and public access to both see and then utilize this data.
Understood, and thanks for that clarification, Jared. I think that's an important difference and distinction. And where my mind was going in terms of security and access is to the database itself, that structure, that's the source data, who owns and manages that. There is a question there about ownership, access, and security. And I think what you're referring to is the use of that information, making that open and accessible, and fully agree.
Richard, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. I'm so pleased to see this moving ahead, and I'm glad to be part of this effort. There are two thoughts that come to mind from my experience with public health from public health data. It's really hard, although not impossible, to design a system that is both outward facing and inward facing, and that works equally well in both directions. That is what, by that I mean a system that can answer queries from members of the public or interested agency workers at the local or state level versus a data set, a data structure that is designed to answer sophisticated queries from evaluators, for example, who really need fairly sophisticated in detail access. And, you know, I'm not saying anything terribly profound here. It's just that almost inevitably, if you optimize for the external audience, you won't have the power that the internal users need. And if you optimize for the internal users, it will be complex and difficult for people from outside to use. And so there's a balancing act that needs to be done. The other observation I want to make is that I think we should consider how to attach annotations to the use of various data sets. If certain data sets have known limitations or known difficulties in their use or in their interpretation, is there a way to flag those for users who are perhaps new to the data sets and who are thinking about using them? And that's another level of complexity, but it's not insuperably hard. But it does mean basically being, designing a system that presents the users with notes about various data sets that they're planning to use.
That's helpful. And I think echoing back sort of to your first point, what we heard with the task force and when we first talked about this was to start with prioritizing sort of the internal users, but making sure that the data was accessible and exportable for external users who wanted it. And I think part of that task too, identifying use cases and categories, is really going to be honing in more clearly on what those use cases are, who those users likely are, doing some prioritization, some sort of recommendations on how to phase that in order to build it to, as you said, Richard, make sure it meets the needs or at least the highest priority needs in the near term that the state has.
You are reminding me of a third point, which is that I don't know Vermont's public records laws, but we need to think ahead to how one handles public records requests, and which of the public records requests can be met by just doing a simple query against the data set, and which ones require much more extensive analysis, and how that gets handled as public data requests.
That makes good sense, and I think fits with the recommendation that we heard about the data governance team. Secretary Moore, I see your hand.
Yes, I just, in some ways picking up, I think on themes and concerns Richard was raising, and somewhat selfishly, admittedly, as the agency with kind of the legal obligations, I think we have to sort of separate these two pieces, even in any proposal we would bring to the legislature, and make clear what is essential for our statutory obligations under the Global Warming Solutions Act in terms of tracking and monitoring and assessing progress. And then sort of, I'm reluctant to call them nice to have because I know that they're important, but some of those public facing pieces and recommended enhancements we would make to any system to allow for greater public engagement. But I really think we have to break those apart. I'm concerned that if we don't, A&R is going to end up potentially short on the things we have to have. And we can't be successful if we can't actually at least have technical experts able to track and assess progress over time.
That's a really good point. Thank you for raising that up. Other questions or comments on this piece? Seeing none. So I think that conversation helps to highlight part of the reason that we recommend breaking this into two phases, because there are a lot of questions and known unknowns, and I'm sure unknown unknowns that over the course of those 4 tasks and working with all of you and with the data governance team, we will unearth. So that's why there's a recommendation for a task at the end of phase 1 that really lays out, okay, what are we building? How are we building it? What do we recommend there? And so that would move into a phase 2 for infrastructure development. So creation of a database that achieves the goals that you all were just outlining, and more that will come into more clarity as we dive into the work, and then testing and iterating. It also provides us with the opportunity, Cadmus certainly has data architects and experts in-house, but in the event that you all find over the course of the first phase of your work that there is a very specific tool that you are certain meets every need that you have, provides us the opportunity to make sure that we're aligning any future work sort of with meeting those needs. So this really is just sort of the building phase, and timeline there is listed as TBD because we don't know how complex it will be. That said, one of the questions that I do have for you, especially Secretary Moore, being sensitive to the requirements that you all have in the GWSA, am curious to talk about not just the role of the different committees, which I teed up, but also the timeline for completion. Sort of in an ideal world, when would you have this up and running, at least in a first iteration? So happy to answer questions about phase 2 or take suggestions about phase 2. And then TJ, if you want to give me a time check, I want to make sure I don't eat up your meeting.
I think we can just go a couple more minutes on this one.
Okay. And then I just note that Jane does have a draft scope that we welcome written comments on and are happy to take feedback on as we sort of revise that with her. So I know our time today is short.
Liz, I was just looking, I think, and I will verify this, but that our first sort of major kind of data related reporting requirement is in 2024. And what I don't, because we're required to produce an evaluation of whether we are on track to meet the 2025 goal. What I don't remember is what month of 2024.
Okay.
I'll add it to the chat if I can't. July 1st of 2024. So I think probably targeting to have this sort of fully functional by mid 2023, so we have an opportunity to bring in existing data and add new data is going to be really important. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to go about it, but we do have to by July, on or before July 1st, 2024, essentially ensure that the 2025 greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, we're on track to achieve them.
Okay. Jared, I think you go ahead, TJ.
Oh, sorry. Well, I was just going to go towards setting up a structure for next steps if you didn't have any more slides. In terms of, you mentioned giving back comments. I think we should set a deadline for that for folks. And then I'm not sure if the work group itself needs to meet to provide that feedback, or if it's comments and then maybe collectively the work group reviews the comments or reviews your response to the comments, Liz.
Yeah, and I would say I largely defer to you and Jane on that. I think we're happy to take a review of comments. We're happy to meet with the task force again, whatever feels best for folks.
Jared, go ahead.
I would just note that while I imagine that the folks making up the data governance team would come in part from state staff and perhaps members of this subcommittee, I do think that it's important that we look beyond this subcommittee in terms of there are a number of key data tracking organizations in Vermont that, EAN works with, the PSD works with, ANR works with, to get and access data that I think have really important perspectives about, what exists, what the limitations are, what the challenges and opportunities are, in terms of a lot of the tracking that we'll want to do. So I'm thinking in particular, this is not an exclusive or exhaustive list, but I do think it'll be really important to engage in these type of conversations. Folks from Efficiency Vermont, that track a lot of the adoption of, some of the key metrics and benchmarks that we have outlined in the LEAP modeling and in the CAP in terms of, heat pump adoption, advanced wood heat, comprehensive weatherization. But, when we're tracking those things, at EAN or the Public Service Department, those are, dozens of reporting entities. And, some of the larger ones, and utilities on Tier 3 compliance, which is a lot of fossil fuel reduction projects, fuel dealers in terms of, what we know about changes to fossil fuel sales and increasing shares of biodiesel or advanced wood heat. Anyway, I don't want to take too long on this, but I do think it's important that we pause at this stage, even if they're not necessarily part of the data management team, that we plan to make sure that many of the key data providers are part of the conversation about what gets provided and how, and then gaps, barriers, and opportunities, part of that kind of set of the phases and tasks laid out. And some of the key ones I do think are Efficiency Vermont, utilities, and fuel dealers. Not exclusive, but those are some key ones, I think.
Jared, just, I think probably for purposes as much of anything as helping Liz and Dan build a budget, is that something that would take the form of a workshop, like a sort of a one engagement, or are you envisioning an ongoing process? And I guess just starting to think about the more people we bring to the table, appreciating all of the reasons why, the more complicated it becomes.
I mean, I would be really curious to hear from Claire here, because I know that she has been leading a lot of the stakeholder outreach for the Public Service Department in terms of updates to kind of aligning. And I will say that, in the early years of EAN managing the state's community energy dashboard, what we held was a quarterly meeting of stakeholders where we could surface issues around, so they weren't necessarily the ones managing they weren't the ones managing the databases, but it was a way to surface kind of challenges and kind of think together. And so maybe there is like a data management team, but then there's also a broader group of stakeholders that gets brought together for kind of progress checks and to be able to surface key questions or challenges that are emerging.
Yeah, and I can just comment quickly. I don't know if we necessarily thought through what will happen like once the PSD's project is sort of up and running, in terms of, like Jared, you were saying, like regular check-ins like maybe EAN has had. I know in our initial scoping phase with working with Agency of Digital Services on this project, we've done a number of sort of one-on-one conversations with folks like Efficiency Vermont, the regional planning commissions, some of the utilities around sort of data needs and gaps and reporting sort of mechanisms. So that conversation has at least started. I think there's definitely more to have along those lines that you outlined. And certainly, like, I think coordinating those conversations across projects, as we've already discussed, will be important to reduce everyone's reporting burdens.
Yeah, and I think that we probably need to think about pulling in organizations or entities that we haven't participated historically in kind of providing data, particularly as we need to kind of expand what we're looking at to ensure just transitions. And that, when you first started talking, Jared, I thought you were going to talk about bringing in other subcommittees members. And I think that's just another piece that we need to make sure we're engaged with the Ag Subcommittee and Just Transitions and others as well. So with that, I kind of want to put a pin in that, and maybe we could communicate that hopefully in comments. Well, you've heard some of it here, but then in comments on the document, which we will post and circulate to the committee, but post online as well. And then I'm not sure kind of what the right time frame is, especially given the holiday, on when we should be targeting for comments back to you.
Well, I will say that we would like to have a budget for this as soon as possible, just as we reconvene the council in January, think about the GWSA budget and the furthering of the technical analyses articulated within the climate action plan. It'll be important to understand the scope and cost of this sooner rather than later. So I mean, I don't know, based on your scope of work, Liz and Dan and David helped too, I'm sure. It doesn't, I am curious if there are largely like a lot of edits that people want to make, how much time you all need, but the sooner we can get it, the better. Maybe I would suggest, right after the holiday break, if we want to pause and appreciate that next week is busy and before. I guess I asked how many, I imagine Richard and Jared and TJ, a few of you, and I know Julie will probably want to look at that too. How much time you want, knowing that we do want to turn around a scope as fast, cost as fast as possible.
I just put out there for perspective, the governor's going to deliver his budget address on January 18th, and the legislature will immediately then take up work on the budget. And so I do think our target needs to be having the climate, and I know that's going to be challenging, Jane, given the timing of the climate meeting, but we need to factor that into our thinking if the Climate Council is indeed going to submit a letter to the legislature, that it really needs to be as close to January 18th as possible.
I would also say,
Yeah,
go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say we have placeholders right now in the GWSA budget around technical analyses and or contracts that we know are going to keep going. And so being able to plug in priorities sooner rather than later is great. So I imagine that time will work for Liz and others to get a budget in, but building backwards from that would be great.
And I would just offer that in terms of the feedback I have, I think that this framework and the phases and tasks are really good. And most of the feedback I would have would be once we get underway, and in terms of some of the possible composition of that data management team, and then maybe some of the stakeholders. So if that's helpful, I mean, I can help submit some of that feedback, that more specific stuff, and we'll look forward to engaging more later. But I don't think it's at the level that's really going to impact the kind of overall framework as presented in phases and tasks here, which I think are great. And I don't think it would affect the budget. I don't know if others have feedback that they think would likely affect the kind of overall framework or scope of this, and see a missing phase or task that would affect the budget.
Well, if I can jump in before anyone else chimes in, I think one of the areas that we do see affecting the budget that has nothing to do with a new or different task is the role of this subcommittee on and with the data governance team, right? So who's leading that? Who's involved in it? What are the roles of EFG and CADMIS in that? Because I think those kind of questions will affect or help determine what that budget should be.
And I think I would say that I think CADMIS and EFG can start putting heads together, sort of having heard that you don't think there's anything missing, and start to at least build a base. And then if you all bring back comments about or answers around those roles or other things that we can tweak from there, sort of along the timeline to make sure that we hit the Climate Council. So any substantive comments that you think would really change the structure, I would say sooner the better. But otherwise, we can start moving forward with what we have, and then start tweaking. If you do come back with more detail on quarterly meetings with external stakeholders, or bi-weekly meetings with the subcommittee, in addition to meetings with the governance team, etc.
Okay, so I didn't hear a date for And yeah, I don't know, I know the next 2 weeks are super challenging for the department, having also just released an energy plan and being responsive to comments on that are absolutely substantive, and hoping that a lot of you are commenting on it.
Mhm. Can we just say that any substantive comments would be by next Friday? And then any other tweaks, edits, changes, suggestions can be the Friday after, whatever that is. I don't know if January 1st is a Saturday, is that correct?
It is,
That's right,
yeah.
yeah.
So each Friday is likely a holiday for you all.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I meant like the Friday after New Year's.
The 7th? Yeah.
Yeah. If there's tweaks or minor edits or revisions by then, that would be great. But
Okay, so let's say next Thursday, which is the 23rd, for anything substantive to highlight it and flag it. And then following on that, the 7th of January for any other detailed comments. Right. Thank you.
Richard is asking for a copy of the slides, and is the intent also to share the draft scope that goes behind those slides, that supports the slides?
Yes, that's what I was referring
yes,
to.
That was what I was asking for.
Yep.
Yeah, so those
I
will be.
haven't gone through all my emails from this morning yet, but I had sent that to Jared and TJ yesterday to send out, but maybe it hasn't gotten sent to the subcommittee yet.
I don't think it has. It didn't get sent to the subcommittee.
That's no problem. We'll send that out then.
Okay, great. Well, this was one of the concerns about trying to have a short meeting, but still have several topics in the meeting. Thank you, Liz and Dan. Very much appreciated for setting out the framework and presenting it today. So we have 2 topics on the agenda. I'm going to, in advance, apologize. I have a hard stop at 4 in interviewing. It's an interview to help get more staff here at the department. But really quickly, I think it would be helpful to take a few minutes if Megan, you could give an update on the process for the RFI on supplemental analysis.
Yeah, sure. So just to remind folks, this was a component that was put forward in the climate action plan as a result of the discussions of this subcommittee. And so the Agency of Natural Resources will be putting out a request for information, which is usually something that's put out in advance of a request for proposals, and we use the responses that we receive from the RFI to inform the request for proposals. And this is related to the life cycle analysis component that this subcommittee has discussed at length. And ANR will be drafting up this RFI and hopefully releasing it early next year. And we're hoping to, of course, have the assistance of members of this subcommittee in making sure that the RFI speaks to all of the information that we want to gather in this exercise. So I'm hoping that we can reach out to some folks as we're working through that. And we can keep you updated with a draft of the RFI to share with the whole subcommittee shortly. But I think just in timeline wise, we're hoping to receive responses this spring and then hopefully move forward with an RFP following that. And just acknowledging that this work is not going to be done in time to produce a parallel product to inform decision making anytime in the near future. This is going to take some time to work through. And so we will be moving forward with compiling the 2018 inventory and kind of going about our normal process and fulfilling our statutory obligation to get that information out parallel to this other kind of information gathering phase on some of these parallel components that we'll be working on. So I hope that is a helpful update, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And Colin is also on the line if there's any more technical questions.
Megan, I'm just wondering if we can pause a little bit more on the detail of the timeline, like working backwards from the goal of, the responses in the spring and an RFP following that. I'm just wondering if you have a sense of, based on when you would want to release the RFP, if you have a target date for when you think we might be able to have a draft to review and discuss. I just want to make sure that there's enough time built in for subcommittee members to review that draft and provide comment before it goes out. And I'm just thinking about then what early next year means in terms of the context of how we kind of set target deadlines and build and plan for kind of when we need to hold and how frequently we need to hold science and data subcommittee meetings early in 2022. Because I know that we'll want to discuss this.
Sure. I guess I would like to speak with Jane offline to set out maybe a more concrete schedule so we can give the committee some better expectations. Is that okay with you, Jane? Okay. So we can get back to you with that, Jared.
Yeah, I think I just want to kind of emphasize that. I think we set the expectation correctly that in the past, when we were talking about this, that the subcommittee would be engaged and have an opportunity to review the RFI before it went out and provide feedback, and not only that, but have the work group really engage. Again, some of the other subcommittees, in particular, the Ag subcommittee, on this issue to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what this, and then there's another, I think, straight to RFP proposal that is related to that subcommittee is kind of maybe taking the lead on managing for the council, if I'm correct.
Yeah, we should talk about that when we start, and if we start to move on that, because the question around the RFP for both the life cycle and the ag emissions component is we need to vet that amongst all the technical analyses in front of us right now. I don't think any decision's been made that we can move forward with the RFI for the life cycle analysis, because it's just our investment of our state staff capacity, but we have to figure out within the constraints of the budget, like which ones will move to RFP and the timeline for all of them. And then, of course, the challenges if one moves forward without the other, the feelings and issues there. So that process hasn't been vetted yet. So we should move forward.
Sorry, I apologize. I didn't mean to infer that RFPs would definitely be happening. I just wanted to make sure that these committees were really engaged with each other and with the process, because I think that's the commitment that this committee made, is to engage in that.
I feel like, and this is something as we do move into actually prioritizing the RFPs, that we should probably have a conversation about the RFP for the ag component coming under sort of the jurisdiction of this subcommittee with the right expertise and commitment informed here, but it just feels so clearly science and data related, and that lack of the silos around like one happening out in a different subcommittee or another created some of the challenges that we experienced at the end moving towards the CHAP. So we might want to have a conversation about which subcommittee, how we brief those components, or create some kind of cross-cutting committee to ensure that constant collaboration, especially on the ag piece.
I guess I would just briefly offer that I think it'll be important that we include folks from both subcommittees in these conversations. To me, the most important thing is that there is kind of a connection and rationality about the RFI and then potential RFP issuers. And my strong preference, I think ANR has gotten used to me making this caveat that I don't mean to kind of point things to you, but I do think that there is a really important, for purposes of consistency and integration, that kind of any RFPs that would happen with relation to the inventory or emissions reporting or compliance with the GWSA, that RFIs and RFPs are going out from ANR. And I think that regardless of what subcommittees engage in and how, that provides some helpful kind of alignment and clear integration between what those RFIs and RFPs would become. I don't know if the Agency of Ag had expressed interest there, but I do think it's really important that that happen through ANR and have input and feedback from both of the subcommittees.
Yeah, and Megan and Colin and I and others met on some of these outstanding questions and issues related to the inventory earlier this week, and I think that was loud and clear, the feeling of the staff who managed the inventory as well.
So at a minimum, I think this is a agenda item for our first meeting of next year to really kind of nail down if Megan, you and Jane have kind of a better timeline as when a RFI would be complete and setting up kind of the working group. We have a greenhouse gas group from this committee, but also the one that engages ag. Also a decision to be made on which committee has jurisdiction, as you put it, Jane. And that may not be just our decision. I think that's a broader discussion as well. But I just wanted to summarize so that to make sure it's captured and that we can come back and circle back to it.
I think for the RFI for the life cycle analysis, we were envisioning, initially, as we're working through a draft, to present to the entire subcommittee to review, to work first with the greenhouse gas inventory task group that's already established within this subcommittee. And then, I don't know how the RFP for the ag related questions would be worked up. So, but that's where we are for the RFI for life cycle.
Great. Any other comments on the RFI?
Thanks, Megan. Look forward to discussing that timeline and working the draft when we get there. Really important work. Thanks.
Yeah, we're trying to balance getting the next inventory out with this other work. So just bear with us.
So just really quickly, I think we could before I have to turn into a pumpkin, I want to just bring up the topic of the subcommittee composition. I think we moved forward at the pace that we needed to with kind of this small group. But I want to I don't think we have time for a robust discussion today, but I wanted to put it in folks' minds that we probably, we should think about the group, if this is the right size of the group, if we have the right people, the makeup in terms of skills and diversity. I do want to note that the department scored a coup and actually recruited somebody from a utility. Lou Ciceri has now joined the Department of Public Service as a planning engineer. We're super excited about that. I think it was okay to have, we're so stoked. But it was okay to, have this meeting, which with no kind of votes or anything, but I think going forward, it probably isn't appropriate to have two members of the Public Service Department as a voting members, although we still, staff and do everything we need to have this committee, fulfill its obligations and do its work. But that's just one piece of it. Really, it's diversity. It's the right people to do the right work. We had talked about an economist previously to join the committee, and I just want folks to start thinking about that for our next meeting. I don't know if Jared, you wanted to add anything there.
No, I agree. And if folks can start thinking either about kind of types of experience or expertise or kind of, perspectives or experience that would be really valuable, definitely want to take that up in the new year. I think we're already kind of are we the smallest subcommittee? I think we already had noted that we had at least 1 or 2 open spots. And if that is the situation with Lou, and again, congratulations, there's so much of it in the chat, then, you know, maybe that's an additional one, but really reassured to know you're not going far, Lou, and can still engage and contribute to these conversations, even if not as a voting subcommittee or a full subcommittee member.
Yep, happy to contribute.
So with that, I think unless there's anything else, we could head to public comment. But before we do, is there anything subcommittee members wanted to add about today's conversation or anything we missed? Okay, hearing none, I am going to apologize. We're going long. I do have to drop off. I'll circle back and check the record. This is the second meeting in a row I've had to do that. And so I'm going to plan for these meetings to go long so that I don't. Appreciate everybody that's going to comment publicly, and I'll let Jared facilitate that.
Thanks, TJ. Good luck. So before we move to public comment, I just do want to pause on one thing. And maybe this is a quick question for Jane and or Marion, which is about scheduling subcommittee meetings next year. And I'm just wondering, to what degree do we need to coordinate and rationalize with other subcommittees so we don't have overlap? I know that, you know, for us, it's really important to do so because of Dr. Dupini-Giroux and Dr. Schaefer with academic schedules that we will need to make sure that those get accommodated. So I'm just looking for a little bit of initial guidance so we can give a heads up to subcommittee members about how that process will play out, so that we can get some calendars on meetings on the calendar for next year.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I think stay tuned would be my initial answer. Both Rural Resilience and Ag and Ecosystems are meeting tomorrow, and I think are going to discuss whether or not they want to do a new set of scheduling for the new year or keep their same dates. And I would hope Cross Sector Points talks about that on tomorrow for Thursday. So I think we'll stay tuned to see. I'm anticipating, at least for potentially Rural Resilience, they may choose to keep the same meet time. But if the decision from Science and Data is that you all would like to schedule a new time, particularly for Leslie and Jay for teaching schedules, I think you all should see what times work best for you all, and then we can work around that. Yeah, I think we just need to wait and see if others want to change their schedules as well for 2022.
Thanks, Marion. All right, well, we'll figure that out by email. But for now, let's move to public comment. George, please go ahead.
Good afternoon and happy holidays, everybody. And congratulations on putting the cap across the finish line. So you can cool your jets for a few minutes, and when Christmas is over, then you can get back in the saddle. I did have a short question addressed to Ms. O'Toole. She's still available. I was inquiring as to the relationship between the RFI and RFP process and the ANR's statutory obligation to do proposed rulemaking process for life cycle emissions. If that's something that's been considered, and what coordination or scheduling of that would be as an activity as compared to the other work that's in play.
Megan, are you available to address that, or maybe?
My apologies, Jared. I had to step away for just a moment. George, could you repeat your question?
Certainly. I was inquiring as to whether your organization had a particular time schedule and for moving forward with proposed rulemaking on life cycle emission factors inventory. What's the relationship of that work with the RFI process? and the RFP process that might ensue.
No, we do not currently have any plans in place to move forward with that rulemaking under 582. And I'll defer to Julie if she wants to add any more there, but I don't believe that will be at present. I don't believe that that's envisioned to be a component of the RFI exercise.
Okay. So from my perspective, it would appear that completion of that activity, the RFI and perhaps the RFP process, might be a prerequisite for having the information in hand to actually proceed with the rulemaking. At least by initial appearance, that's what I would expect.
I think it's possible that the information that we gather will help inform whether or not a rule is feasible. I acknowledge that is definitely a possibility.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's an important distinction, Megan. I wouldn't be comfortable reflecting it as a commitment, but absolutely to do the work and understand what sort of the opportunities and challenges are with proceeding.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at this time? Zach, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks everybody for all of your hard work. Congratulations on producing this first edition of the Climate Action Plan. Tremendous accomplishment on all of your parts, and yeah, really appreciate your time and energy over the last year. I wanted to just ask a question about the relationship between the comprehensive and I realize TJ has just stepped out, but the comprehensive energy plan and the recommendation from the CAP related to biomass electricity. Could somebody speak to kind of the order of operations here? Will the climate action plan be completed before the final edition of the comprehensive energy plan is released, so that you know, the recommendation from the CAP informs what goes into the comprehensive energy plan, or will we see it the other way around? I guess my understanding was that, you know, one was, you know, the CEP was supposed to be closely tied to this CAP effort, and so I'm hoping that, you know, depending on how that conversation progresses, you know, that you know, what is decided upon here between you all and the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and then the Climate Council informs that other process. Just curious if somebody might be able to speak to that, but thank you.
I would defer to Julie or others if you want to. I can take a shot at it, but
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be important to have TJ potentially follow up with Zach, and we can flag this question for him. But at the same time, there's a statutorily mandated deadline for the comprehensive energy plan. I believe it's January 15th, which is why the department has been moving so aggressively. And I'm confident in saying the council won't have completed its work around the biomass recommendation by then. I believe we notion somewhere in the 6-month range for the additional time needed for that conversation.
yeah, thanks.
Jared,
I was assuming the exact same thing. Zach, if you don't mind, I would definitely encourage you to ask that question to TJ, but my assumption is that this where there is language that speaks to the importance of consistency between the climate action plan and the comprehensive energy plan, it is consistency presumably between the initial climate action plan and the comprehensive energy plan as required to be submitted by January 15th. I think that the question about future revisions to the CAP and then what that means for the status of the CEP is one that I don't fully understand and is a good question. But
yeah, thanks, Jared, and thank you, Secretary Moore. I guess, you know, it's disappointing to me to hear that we're putting the cart before the horse here, I guess, on this one, as far as I can tell. I mean, your all's recommendation, the Climate Council's recommendation, and that of the, those from the subcommittees seem to me to be critical to informing that CEP process. And it's sad to think that, your efforts will not be reflected in the CEP document. I realize that deadlines are deadlines, and you all have done a fantastic job of trying to move this forward on a very tight deadline. I guess to some extent, I'd rather get it right than try to hit specific deadlines. But I realize it's a complicated one. So anyways, thank you for your explanation.
Thank you, Zach. Steve, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I want to first echo what George and Zach said in appreciation for the work you all have done. It's just an amazing piece of work, and that goes for everybody. So thanks so much. I would make one comment on your discussion about related to maybe enhancing the committee or incorporating other forms of missing expertise and even data, and it reflects one of the comments that I heard repeatedly in the lead up to the release of the plan relating to the subject of equity. And that's obviously a core concept of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and it was noted that there aren't many metrics for measuring equity, and it seems so important whether it's a hard metric or not. So I would suggest urge you guys to look at how to address that more thoroughly, and possibly include people who have some more expertise in the equity issues, diversity issues, and perhaps some social scientists who have explored this and know how to put that stuff into data form. It is maybe softer than some of the data, but there are many forms of data hardness. So that's my suggestion. Thanks, and thanks again, everybody. Really great job.
Thank you, Steve. I think that's a great suggestion. For what it's worth, I very much agree with you. I thought it was really helpful to have, especially when she was able to join us for one or two meetings, Dr. Bindu Panikar, and I think that the research and work she's doing is really valuable, and would love to circle back with her about. I know that last semester was not a time that worked well for her, but she, I think, would be somebody that we definitely would want to prioritize having conversations with among other folks. So thanks for that really broad and important suggestion. With that, I don't see any other hands, assuming George, yours is still up from before. If you want to make a second one, please come on camera so I know that it is a new hand. Otherwise, oh, it's down. Okay, so thank you, George. It was great to see you all. Thank you again for all of your dedication and work. Everyone from committee members to staff to folks who've been consistently joining us, or even just joining us for one meeting. Really appreciate it, and just wishing you all the best for the holidays and going into the new year, and really look forward to digging in on this work into 2022 with all of you. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.